It's time for Forward Nation Radio. Now here he is, the host of Forward Nation Radio, David Leventhal.
This week was the Easter egg hunt at the White House, where they hid Easter eggs and children looked for them. Also this week, a new research study came out indicating that the number of Republicans believing in climate change dropped to 1/3 after the White House omitted references to climate change on its websites, indicating that Republicans lack object permanence. So that raises the question, those children who are searching for Easter eggs, if they gained object permanence at 4 to 7 months, at what point do Republicans lose it? We have object permanence, we're Forward Nation Radio, and even when we're not here, we're still around. Thanks for joining us as always on today's show, the legacy of Martin Luther King, democracy, more on Russia, and more on failed Republican policies that won't go away. Let's get right into it. A lot to do today. It is almost to the moment that we are live streaming this, the 50-year anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So naturally, everyone is looking into the legacy of Martin Luther King, as we will as well. First, of course, is a question of race. King famously stood for racial justice. We have seen, since the death of King in the last 50 years, tremendous progress and some regress. The clock tower where I teach at Queens College is named after Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, 3 students who were killed going down to fight for civil rights in Mississippi. Most of our students don't know that. Most of our students have probably never heard of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. That being said, though, interracial romance is commonplace and doesn't get a batted eye. So in some areas of this country, racial progress has been so significant that it basically is just assumed. And yet, in other places, we are seeing the return of the Confederacy. While many of us move forward, we also look and say, we have no idea what it's like in other parts of this country that are racing backwards. We are seeing the same dichotomy when it comes to criminalization. For years, blacks have been disenfranchised, in large part through our criminal justice system. We now have a movement shared even by many conservatives for criminal justice reform. And yet, don't tell the parents of Alton Sterling that things are a whole lot better. We just had a recent study showing the extent and the continuance of wealth inequality and mobility, the difference between whites and blacks. When whites get wealthy, they stay wealthy. Blacks don't tend to stay wealthy, even if they do attain some wealth. We continue to have one political party absolutely tied to its racist base. A political party that succeeds because of its racism. We have Donald Trump, who has thrown away the dog whistles that the Republican Party has relied on for so long, and instead just comes out with blatant racism. But we've moved on in many places beyond this, even in Republican circles. Putting away the dog whistles is more appropriate now when it comes to other disfavored minorities than it was with blacks. Still a problem, but some movement. Just this week, of course, Donald Trump had a Twitter fit, prompted apparently by something he saw on Fox and Friends. And how, when Donald Trump feels cornered, feels less emboldened than he should, how does he go out and get his base back? Why, simple. He tweets racist messages. And he was going in a Twitter shitstorm about immigration and DACA over the last few weeks. And yet, overwhelmingly, this country supports DACA, and this country supports immigration. For more on the legacy of Martin Luther King and race, we'd like to refer you back to a couple of our prior shows. January 17th of this year, where we talked at length about affirmative action. August 23rd of last year, where we talked a lot about race and race relations in this country. Legacy of Martin Luther King is also measured in poverty, in jobs, which was much of what he was about. In fact, when he was assassinated in Memphis, he was in Memphis to support striking sanitation workers. This coincidence is particularly interesting or apt because those workers were part of the AFSCME union, AFSCME, which also happens to be the defendant in the Supreme Court case Janus v. AFSCME, which is trying to get rid of municipal labor unions once and for all. We have seen not a lot of progress in that time on wages. And over most of this 50 years, wages for most American workers have not gone up. And yet, this week, we've seen the result of a successful teacher strike in West Virginia with follow-up strikes in Kentucky and Oklahoma. Teachers there fighting for wage equality. How far they have to go, we're reminded by one teacher who apparently has been teaching in the Oklahoma school district for 30-something years, like 38 years. His current salary, $44,000. King was also about democracy and voting rights. We've been talking at length week after week about the constant threats to very democracy, should it ever exist, in this country, including the threats through voting rights. Gerrymandering. We've made strides there. Most gerrymandering is about political result, not necessarily about preventing blacks from voting because they're black, but preventing them from voting because they'll vote for Democrats. I guess that counts for improvement. Voter suppression is rampant. Take a look at Chris Kobach, the voter suppression king, testifying or acting incompetently, running a case in Kansas, incompetently on voter suppression, still out there fighting. Yes, the arc of the moral universe may yet bend towards justice, but right now it is an open question because it is bending two ways. And that is why among the greatest inspirations in our country right now are the Parkland students, fighting not just for sane gun laws, but basically for democracy itself. The New York Times had an interesting headline this week. Gun control and the fall elections, moment or movement? Which just about sums up the question that everybody has. Is this a moment where the pro-democracy, sane people of this country stand up and fight for what's rightfully theirs? Or does it fade away as these movements have in the past? And ultimately, we're left having laws made by gun manufacturers and people who sleep with their guns. The forces of regression are out there fighting hard. Lora Ingraham, I understand, is on vacation this week, Damien. Lora Ingraham, who is basically the living embodiment of the conservative argument against evolution, came out and attacked Parkland student, Parkland survivor, David Hogg, made fun of him for not getting into his favorite college. This is how vile the right is. Rick Santorum, Republican senator, former Republican senator, was famously on the news telling those students they shouldn't be demonstrating, because after all, democracy is not about demonstrating, it's about learning CPR. That those students should better be spending their time learning CPR than demonstrating. That's not a joke. You've probably already heard about that. Which leads us to ask, first of all, why do you think so small, Rick? Why CPR? Shouldn't they be learning trauma surgery? Wouldn't that be more valuable in helping to piece together the bodies that are ripped apart through gun violence? Why think small? Why aren't they practicing trauma surgery? But of course, it leads us to an even bigger question, which I'm sure you're all asking yourselves, which is, who the fuck is Rick Santorum, and why is he on TV? Why does anybody give a shit what Rick Santorum had to say? Nobody gave a shit while he was a senator, which is largely why he's no longer a senator.
Well, it's slim pickings now because half of Fox is now working in the Trump administration. So, you know, they got to get people on.
There's not a lot left on Fox. They're either working in the Trump administration or apparently they're on vacation.
Yeah, so it's understandable.
Because they've attacked teenage shooting survivors.
Yeah, that's
so it's understandable. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. I don't think he's only on Fox, though. I think certainly he's still on Bill Maher periodically. I see that, and other places. But yeah, I guess Fox may be scraping even further the bottom of the barrel. It's hard to imagine they can get lower than what's already on Fox.
Well, did you hear what the new thing is? Now a lot of folks are saying, well, since the Parkland students are being made to wear clear backpacks, that it's that's progress for them, but the students aren't, of course, happy with just that.
That this is progress, that we're making progress in addressing school shootings by having
clear backpack, right? Basically, every other measure other than to ban, you know, the AK-47s and larger guns, because, you know, those will fit into a backpack.
Do they make see-through bulletproof backpacks? We have two trends in conflict, I think, here.
No, that's exactly what one of the issues is that, well, who wins out between the backpack companies, the ones that are Kevlar or the ones that are just plastic?
Well, the NRA is going to have to figure out how to sell clear plastic backpacks, and then it's a win-win.
They'll figure something out.
We're asking ourselves, it's nice that so shortly in the wake of this crisis, we almost have to make jokes about it. We're asking ourselves, democracy, who is represented? On our side, we've got right. We've got the better arguments, but the other side has the might. The other side has the money. The other side has the big businesses. There was an interesting article, I don't know if anybody saw it, Damien, if you had a chance to see it, in The New Yorker this month, about Marion Hammer, who is the lead NRA lobbyist in Florida. And it is chilling how powerful this woman is and what a hold she has over Florida lawmakers who, if they want to remain Florida lawmakers, need to pick up the phone and need to do whatever she asks. We've also seen this week, I know you've seen this, the propaganda video that was made about Sinclair Broadcasting, which is still in the process of gobbling up all of our local TV stations, and how blatantly full of shit they are in spreading propaganda. These are all anti-democratic. These are all anti the kind of things that Martin Luther King Jr. was fighting for and that reasonable people in America are fighting for. And if we want to promote King's legacy, we need to fix these problems. One way to fix these problems, again, is to be heard, to keep the fight up. We keep asking you that. In just a few weeks, April 23rd in Albany, will be Walk the Talk on Climate, where climate protesters in New York State will be appealing to Governor Cuomo and New York State legislators to walk the walk rather than just talk the talk on climate change. The good news, Governor Cuomo, who has a history of forgetting which side he's on, wanting to run for president, now seems to understand that he needs to get his liberal on a little bit. And this might be a time that a march could do some good if there is some action, if there is the knowledge, the demonstration that a lot of people care about this issue. So join the Walk the Talk on Climate on April 23rd in Albany if you can, or do your support however you can. Support whatever local marches and local democracy are in your area. By the way, speaking about right versus might, I understand, Damien, the president isn't talking a whole lot about the stock market these days, having apparently torpedoed that one as well. It turns out the Trump bump among stocks, which was ridiculous in the first place, And we've pointed out, and we still believe, that equating economic health to the success of the stock market is ridiculous. But it is funny how the Trump bump apparently has become, what, the dumbass crash?
Apparently, what are we borrowing now? Close to $300 billion to pay for stuff now?
Not a wall, though.
No, not a wall.
Not a wall.
I think Mexico.
Conservatives are up in arms about that. All the stuff, and what they're upset about is that they don't get their wall. Yeah, we're declaring trade wars, which it turns out aren't so easy to win, apparently. The bottom line here is, if you want your country to work competently, you need to make democracy work. And 50 years after the death of Martin Luther King Jr., we have more and more reason to be recommitted to making democracy work. Register your friends, register your family, create voting parties, carpools to go to the booth, but get people out to vote. John Nichols in The Nation magazine had a story, the title of which I think really summed it up this week. Republicans have an ingenious plan to stop losing special elections. Don't hold them. When all else fails and you keep losing elections, try not to hold elections. That's where we've come. We have got to get them out of power because nothing gets fixed in this country until some element of democracy comes back in. All right, speaking of democracy, Russia. Boy, the week started off so quietly, with Russia expelling 60 U.S. diplomats in retaliation for our expelling some of their diplomats. And boy, was Trump pissed. Not at Russia, actually. I understand he was pissed because we still had 60 diplomats? What was that Secretary of State guy doing? That guy needs to be Twitter fired. That we still had 60 diplomats left in this country that Russia could have managed to expel. They really should Twitter fire that. Oh, sorry, been there, done that.
Yeah, no, I think it was, I think they're just going to be replaced now, so Putin wins again?
So, well, maybe they're not going to be able to put the CIA guys back in. I'm sure that's the comfort that Trump might have. To say we had 60 diplomats there, we're trying to get rid of all of our diplomats, but to be fair, a lot of them probably were CIA agents, so we don't have to worry about quite as many diplomats. This is where we've come in this country. But Vladimir Putin did accept an invitation to come visit the White House. That's right. In fact, he accepted it very quickly because it turns out at a time when he's being ostracized by every Western democracy. Well, apparently that doesn't include America. Turns out Trump continues on his, what do we call it, 50 autocrats in 50 weeks tour, where Trump can meet with every autocrat in the world because he's such a great negotiator. We also learned this week from Russia that everybody wants to meet with President Trump, including the Russians, because they all know he's such an incredible tool, and he has filled his administration with such incompetence that they all know that they could roll him all the time. So for all kinds of reasons, Putin is eager to come meet Trump. And now the debate in the White House apparently is between Donald Trump, who wants to do what Donald Trump wants to do and always wanted to meet Vlad and become buddies, and the rest of the White House that thinks it's not necessarily a good idea. Speaking of not meeting with people, Robert Mueller. Yes, all this quaint old stuff from Russia early in the week has been pushed off the news pages by the announcement that the Mueller team has let the Trump team know that he is not yet, apparently, the target of their criminal investigation, but he is a subject of their criminal investigation, which means that he has engaged in behavior that gets them very concerned, and his name has come up often enough in criminal investigation that they are concerned about his role in that criminal misconduct. But he's not yet a target. Trump thinks that's a wonderful thing. He's celebrated, and apparently is all the more eager to testify to Mueller, which presumably is the one thing most certain to turn him into a target. Trump probably doesn't understand that not being a target is a good thing in this case. The bigger issue here is not just, gee, they have reason to be concerned, but they're not yet uncovering criminal misconduct. I would say the problem is probably much worse than that for Trump. which is that we've said all along that people have been arguing that for the most part, what President Trump and his team was involved with doing with respect to the campaign and once he was in office probably doesn't rise to the level of criminal misconduct. It probably does rise to the level of impeachable conduct if you had a functioning Congress. So what in fact Mueller might be saying is, he's not a target because what he did can't really be a crime, as awful as it was. And instead, we'll be asking the House for impeachment, or at least setting a memo indicating the case for impeachment. We reached out to Trump's legal team for comment, only to be told, sorry, we have no legal team anymore. We're working on it. Legal team in progress. And you may have missed this one because it didn't make the front pages of the news, but this is exciting. We may have another porn star back into our Russia fold. Turns out there is an escort, I believe from Belarus, firmly in the Russian orbit, who is also does porn instructional videos or porn instruction demonstrations, who is claiming that she is being evicted from Thailand, sent out of Thailand, back to Russia, and is concerned because of what she knows. And her partner as well saying the same thing. And we are concerned enough about the truth of this because this apparently is someone who hung around with a lot of people very close to Vladimir Putin and people close to Paul Manafort, including Paul Manafort. That in fact our FBI went to interview them because it turns out they probably do know stuff, or may know stuff. So we may have more porn stars back in the news, which will keep Russia active for a while. Anyway, we've been talking for a while about conservative policies and how they won't seem to die no matter how discredited they've been. We've talked about white victimization. Appropriate to bring that up again on the 50th anniversary of the death of MLK. We've talked about supply-side economics, as evidenced by the tax bill and all kinds of Republican policies. Well, this week we've had a lot of information about another that we've discussed in the past, privatization. This is another Republican basic policy theory that privatization works because government is bad, private industry is good. This is the Trump infrastructure plan, for the most part, which is just to sell American government resources off to private entities that could make money off of it. This is IBG, YBG. I'll be gone, you'll be gone. Rather than preparing for the future and thinking long-term for the good of America, let's sell it to some private business that's only concerned about its profits in the next year or two, so they can make decisions that will destroy the planet. We've seen this with the firing of David Shulkin at the VA. And David Shulkin's op-ed, expecting that firing. I am convinced that privatization is a political issue aimed at rewarding select people and companies with profits, even if it undermines care for veterans. Because historically, privatizing health care has actually weakened health care and made it more expensive. We've seen that with the privatization of Medicare, where people have the right to opt into private Medicare plans instead of being on the public Medicare system. Every time someone opts into Medicare Part D, it costs the government more money. Why? Health industry executives need to be paid huge money. That comes out of health care spending. Well, just in the last day or so, we've seen further reports about private jail horrors. We've talked about this in the past. We've been privatizing our prison system. Obama tried to put a stop to that at the federal level because it turns out that when you privatize a prison system, any cost savings that are realized at the expense of treatment of detainees and safety. Well, that Obama-era policy regarding federal privatization of prisons is being rescinded. Let's privatize, 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 because there's always money to be made by somebody. The fact that there are jail horror stories in privatized prisons should actually surprise nobody. And of course, famously, we are seeing it in education. The Kentucky and Oklahoma teacher strikes are the reason that Betsy DeVos and other conservatives are at war with public education. If you take away their right to unionize, if you privatize education and take away municipal teachers' unions, they don't get to engage in work stoppages. They will not get to engage in collective action. Believe me, private industry has learned to prevent unionization efforts. And we've seen a lot this week on the most noxious of all basic Republican ideas, that of deregulation. That we are better off if we deregulate. I ask my students, as I'll ask you, are we better off if we just get rid of the police forces around America? I understand that given some of what we're going to talk about in a future show, a lot of people might be tempted to think that might be better. But nobody seriously thinks that the best way to move forward as a society is to get rid of police forces. And yet human beings have an ethical obligation, which they frequently don't follow. Corporations have no ethical obligation. They are supposed to be selfish sons of bitches. So if you don't think that you can get rid of police force and have society function properly, what makes you think that you could get rid of regulation of private businesses and have it work properly? What do you think? What we learned from Russia and Russia malls? More than 64 people dead, many of them children, because we don't have functioning emergency exit regulations or fire alarm regulations? You really think this is a good time to take away regulations about fire safety? We had Christopher Wiley, one of the founders of Cambridge Analytica, testifying in the UK, the House of Commons, about how data theft and misuse may not only have endangered the world by making Donald Trump the President of the United States, but apparently was behind Brexit as well. And maybe Kenya too, we now learn. Elections in Kenya may have been undermined by data firms and stolen data. Do you think this is a good time to deregulate data, the use of data, the protection of your Social Security number? How about inspection of Gulf oil rigs? We've talked about this one before. We're moving in the direction of taking away safety regulations on Gulf oil rigs. Here's a New York Times article. They've been doing inspections of rigs that have had problems in the past. The results were still being compiled, but the inspectors found serious problems, including some that were potentially life-threatening. There are still some major incidents that are occurring, and we need to figure out why. Or let's just deregulate, and then we don't ever have to figure out why. People eventually will die, but that'll probably be someone else's problem. In the meantime, look at all the billions of dollars that could be stolen. IBG, YBG. We've seen Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of Theranos, who has done the seemingly impossible in making people feel sympathetic for Martin Shkreli, saying he's a son of a bitch, but why does he go to prison and she gets nothing and remains a billionaire? And most famously, we look to the people running our country. No, not just the president, who, let's face it, anybody think deregulating his business ventures would be a good idea? Trump University, Trump Steaks, all the bullshit that he did? No, for now I'm talking about his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. His family filing false housing documents. And not a few. It was practice to file false housing documents covering up housing discrimination, we might add, on the 50th anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King. Jared Kushner blames it on outsourcing. That's right. We're not responsible for what we do. We hire people to do it for us, and they file false documents on our behalf. So that's not our fault. Don't try that at home, kids, with your tax returns or any other documents, saying, well, I signed it and all, but I didn't actually fill that out. I had someone do that for me. But of course, you don't live a life like the Kushners live. You don't get to live like the rich tend to live in this country. And that is by utterly avoiding any sense of responsibility. And ultimately, that's what so much of this economic, political, social policy coming out of the right is all about. It is all about how the wealthy avoids responsibility for their own shit. They make messes, and they have other people clean it up. We will spend a lot of time on the rich avoiding responsibility, hopefully on our next show, depending on what blows up in the news, but certainly on a show very soon. But before we leave, I would like to leave with one thought on the concept of responsibility. We somehow manage to lionize the rich, in part perhaps because we look at people being able to lead irresponsible lives and getting away with everything, and that seems wonderful. We had an example recently of the kind of person that we should be lionizing in America and the world. A French gendarme, Arnaud Beltrame, who showed what real civic virtue is all about, what real heroism is all about, by sacrificing his life on behalf of one of his fellow citizens. Bone spurs and all, perhaps. Maybe they'll make a movie about him at some point. Will his family be rich, like the family of successful criminals are? Never. And until we start lionizing people like this, we're going to be ruled by the kind of people we look up to, but should be looking down to. Anyway, that's today's show. More on this later. Happy celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life on his 50th anniversary of his death. Like looking forward, go to forwardnationradio.com. That's forwardnationradio.com and get the full experience. You'll see the video from this and every episode there and on our YouTube channel as well. Don't miss the next Forward Nation Radio podcast at Podbean, podbean.com. If you love what you heard, like us on Facebook, gag. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Tell your friends. Spread the word. Forward Nation Radio. See you next week.
You've been listening to Forward Nation Radio with David Leventhal.